In this video, I'm going to talk about the chain and cassette and hubs. Let's start with the chain and cassette. When I first started touring, I usually took my bike to a bicycle mechanic once a year for maintenance. And at that point in time, I was putting about 4,000 miles on the bike every year. And what I found out was every time I took the bike in for maintenance, both the chain and the cassette had to be replaced. Now the reason was I was letting the chain go far too long. If you maintain the chain more frequently, if you replace the chain more frequently, it turns out you can extend the life of your cassette by quite a bit. And the main reason for that is that as the chain wears, it gets longer. The distance between the rollers increases. They call that chain stretch, but it really isn't chain stretch. What happens is the bushings and the pins where at each one of the rollers wears and increases the distance between the rollers. So what happens is as the chain gets longer, it will wear the corners off of the cassette teeth. And it will also elongate the spaces in between the cassette teeth. Now that has a couple of bad effects. One is that it affects shifting. And secondly, if you replace the chain and don't replace a worn cassette, then you can also impact the life of the new chain. The new chain won't last as long. So it pays to pay attention to the chain wear. And there are a couple of easy ways to measure chain wear. One way to measure chain wear is to use a ruler. And the way you do that is that you choose a pin, and then you count 24 more pins, and you measure the distance between the center of the first pin and the center of the last pin. On a new chain, that distance will measure 12 inches. The rule of thumb is that if it measures 12 1/16 or more, you should replace the chain. There are a few tools on the market that make it easier to measure chain wear, and the one I like is the Park Tool chain checker. Now the way this works is that you put these pins between the rollers, and then you push this down until the pins press against the rollers and you get a snug fit. Then you pull the tool out, and you can read in this window, you can read the wear. And what it says on the tool is that a new chain measures between 0.25 and 0.5, and that a chain should be replaced at 0.75. Now I've used this tool quite a bit, and I can tell you that in my experience, at 0, that's a new chain. And that at 0.75, in fact, that is 12 1/16 across 24 pins. So the tool is fairly accurate, and it's much more reliable than trying to measure by hand. I began measuring chain wear myself, and when I did that, I also started replacing the chains myself. And for my style of riding, I find I can get about 2,000 miles on a chain. And your experience may be slightly different depending on your style. You'll find plenty of great YouTube videos on the topic of replacing chains. The only thing you need to be aware of is there are two basic types of chains. One uses a pin to connect the links, and the other uses a master link. Now there are also cases where you may need to shorten a chain to match the length of the chain that's already installed on your bike. And for that you need a simple tool. The tool that you need to do chain replacement is a pin press. And there are many different versions of pin presses, but they all work basically the same way. There's a pin that when you turn the screw, you can push pins out to remove links from a chain. And in the case of chains which are connected using pins, you can use this to install a new pin. When you replace your chain, you should check the condition of your cassette. And if the cassette is worn, you should replace it. You can also check your chain rings. but the chain rings are much less subject to wear because of their size. My chain rings have 20,000 miles on them, and I think I could get another 20,000 out of them. The way to check for wear on your cassette is to look at the teeth on the cassette sprockets. And in this case, you can see that the teeth have a nice square shape, which is what they should look like. The exception is the higher speed sprocket, the one with the fewest teeth. This sprocket has naturally a slightly different tooth shape than the other sprockets, but this one is perfectly normal, and in fact it's the sprocket that I use the least. This sprocket and chain have about 2,000 miles on them, and so things are looking good after 2,000 miles. I just need to replace the chain. The final thing you need to look for is missing teeth on the sprockets, and of course if you have any missing teeth, you'll need to replace the cassette. If you find you need to replace your cassette, there are plenty of great YouTube videos that discuss the process for doing that. But you will need two tools. One is a wrench to hold the cassette while you remove the retaining nut. And there are a lot of different variants of this tool, but they all have short lengths of chain that engage with the teeth of the cassette so that you can keep it from spinning while you're removing the retaining nut. The other tool you need is a wrench to remove the retaining nut. In addition to checking your chain for wear, there is regular maintenance you should do on the chain, and that is keeping it lubricated. And I use Finish Line dry bike lubricant. There are other lubricants for chains available on the market. What you don't want to do is use WD-40 or household oils. You want to use something that's specifically formulated to work with bicycle chains. And I do it every 50 miles or so. If I'm on a tour, I'll do it at the end of each day. When I'm riding training runs at home, I just kind of keep track and do it every 50 miles or so. The technique that I use to apply oil to the chain is to squirt the oil onto the chain while running it in reverse. Now you want to be careful when you're doing that not to get, if you have rim brakes, not to get any oil on the rim. While you're at it, you can also add oil to the pivot points on your derailleur. When you replace your chain, it's a good time to also check a couple of other things, namely your cables and your brake pads. So you can use the replacement of the chain as a reminder to check those other things. To check your cables, what you need to look for is signs of fraying or wear at the exit points from the cable guides, and also points where the cables are connected to the brakes or the derailleur. Checking the brake pads is one of the easier maintenance tasks that you can do because all it is a simple visual inspection of the pads. And what I do is I keep a spare set of pads around so that I can compare the new pads with the ones that are on the bike. The final topic for this video is hubs. But before I turn to hubs, let me talk briefly about handlebar tape. Now, handlebar tape is one of those things that really doesn't require much maintenance. And typically we only replace handlebar tape when it gets worn out. But I had an incident happen a couple of years ago. I had a fall, and I wasn't injured and I wasn't moving very fast. But when the bike hit the ground, it hit the ground kind of hard, and the handlebar snapped right here. When I got home, I took the handlebar tape off, and what I found was corrosion and pinholes right there where the failure happened. And I found the corrosion and pinholes on both the left and right side of the handlebars. Now what caused that was that over time my body sweat, the salt from my sweat and the moisture caused the corrosion in the pinholes. So what I recommend is every once in a while, even if your bar tape is in decent shape, remove it, clean the handlebars with some fresh water, and then rewrap the handlebars with new bar tape. So now let's talk about hubs. In the past, I was testing my hubs by rotating the wheels when they were on the bike. Now the problem with that is it can be misleading, because if there's any roughness or binding in the hubs, the momentum and the mass of the tires and the wheels are going to mask that. So the best way to examine your hubs is to take the wheels off the bike and rotate the axles by hand. And you'll very easily feel any binding or roughness when you do that. Now I do that every time that I change the chain on my bike. Changing the chain for me is kind of a memory jogger for a number of routine activities, maintenance activities that I do on my bike, and checking my hubs is one of those maintenance activities. So what happens if you find you have a bad hub? Well, I don't like any of the choices, frankly. One of them, the most extensive, is to actually replace the hub assembly. When you do that, you'll end up retightening the spokes and retruing the wheel. Now that can be both time consuming, and if you don't do it yourself, it can be expensive. Another alternative for hub repair is to replace the bearings. There are two types of bearings in bicycle hubs. There are cartridge bearings and there are cup and cone bearings. If you have cartridge bearings and if you have the right kind of tools, you can remove and replace the bearings. With cup and cone bearings, there is another problem that I see. That is that the inner race, or the cup, is built into the hub. And so you can't remove and replace the inner race. The only parts that you can replace are the bearings and the cones. So for me, that's a problem, because you're installing new parts with an old part, and my feeling is that the new parts will wear much more quickly with the old races. So what a lot of people like to do with cup and cone bearings is they like to do regular maintenance. What they do is they'll take the hubs apart, clean all the parts, clean the bearings, the cones, the cups, re-grease, and then reassemble the whole thing, and then readjust. And I see a couple of problems with that approach. I see that in this type of a hub, the bearings are loose, and so you really need to be careful not to lose any bearings. But even more problematic is that you can over-tighten or under-tighten the cones. And if you over-tighten the cones, you can cause an effect that's called brunelling. And what brunelling is a transfer of metal among the different parts, among the inner race, the bearings, and the cones. And what that causes is a rough surface on those parts, and that can cause premature wear. Similarly, if you under-tighten the cones, you'll get uneven wear and also cause premature wear of the parts. So the final alternative, and the one that I prefer, is just to replace the entire wheel set. My feeling is that if you have good components, I've used Shimano Dior XTs, and they have a good reputation for longevity. And so I feel that if you use good components, you'll get the life out of the bearings and the hubs without a lot of interim maintenance. I got 17,000 miles out of my Dior XTs before I had to replace them. Another good reason that I replaced the entire wheel set was that I have rim brakes, and by the time I replaced the wheel set, it was the rims were getting kind of ratty. One final item about sealed parts and maintenance, and that is power washing. I recommend never power washing your bike. Power washing will cause water intrusion into hubs, into bottom brackets, and other sealed parts, and significantly reduce their life. So avoid power washing at all costs. So that's it for this video. Next video I will deal with the bottom bracket. As you can see, I've already removed the bottom bracket because I've done the videos out of order. But the bottom bracket video will deal with the steps for removing the bottom bracket and also bottom bracket problem diagnosis. So join me with that next video. In the meantime, thank you for watching this video.